All right, here we go. This is week 1, Philadelphia Eagles versus Green Bay Packers. Packers have a 1st and 10 at the Eagles' 42-yard line. All right, and what we have offensively, the personnel group is one back here, one tight end here, so that's 11 personnel. Formation is 2 receivers to this side, and there was originally 2 to this side. These are cut split. We have an on the ball tight end here, and he was in a cut split, so this would be cut 22 on cut. Now we're going to get motion to I backs. So even though 13 here is a receiver and motions all the way across, he ends up at the snap of the ball back in the backfield. All right. So what we're really concerned about when we're talking about formations and backfields is at the snap of the ball. The rest of it's really just all window dressing. Okay. The only thing that really matters is what's the formation, what's the backfield when the ball is snapped. So in this case, now we have cut 21 on with I backs. All right, I backs. All right. So the Eagles are in an 8-man front here, and you can tell because we have a single high safety up here. Okay. And CJ Gardner-Johnson is down in the box. Okay. So this is an 8-man box. All right. Because it's an 8-man box, we are a little bit stouter against the run, but with 2 backs in the backfield, and we will consider 13 a back here because he's lined up in the backfield. All right. Backfield is anything in between the tackles and off the ball. So he is a fullback in this case. We're treating him as such, and his role for this play really is as a fullback. He's going to lead block. So we're going to get an ISO here. And then we're going to talk about what the gap fits are supposed to be. So he leads up on Gardner-Johnson here. Gardner-Johnson fits it outside, so he's boxing that back. All right, and Bond ends up on the inside half of that gap making a nice tackle. All right, now we're going to talk about this from the other angle. Okay, so from this angle, before we get the motion, we have an 8-man box. All right, here's our nickel out here. All right, here's our down safety here. So there's 8 guys in the box, 4 defensive linemen, 2 middle linebackers, or 2 inside linebackers. We got a down safety, and we got our nickel here. Those are our 8 guys in the box. The rule is 1 back, one gap. 8-man box, 1 back, 1 gap. All right, so you can see Nakobe Dean and Zach Bond are lined up right in their gaps. All right, so that's appropriate. Now, when we get the motion, all right, that should bump them over a gap. Right, so basically now Bond should just be able to move. Well, Bond can still sit in that A gap. Nakobe Dean can still sit in that B gap there, right? But when they motion all the way back to the backfield, right here before the snap, right, we've created I backs. Now we have 2 backs in the backfield. All right, so when there's 2 backs in the backfield, even if we have an 8-man box, we still have 2 potential gaps. And it's all dictated on where the fullback goes because he's going to essentially create a new gap. All right, so there's a couple places the fullback can go. He can go out here to the C gap, all right, in which case now we would have 2 C gaps, inside and outside. All right, and then Gardner-Johnson could fit the outside half of that. Bond would fit the inside half of that. Okay, if the fullback goes to this A gap strong, all right, then we can have Bond on the outside half of that, and Nakobe Dean on the inside half of that. All right, and Johnson still in the C gap. If we go here to this B gap, well, now we've got Nakobe Dean on the inside half of this, and our nickel that you can't see in the screen right now out here on the outside half of this. All right, then Bond would still be in the A gap, and Gardner-Johnson would still be in the C gap. All right, so those are the 3 possibilities where the fullback could go and create a new gap. All right, so those are the possibilities for the linebackers. All right, so as it turns out, he goes to the C gap. All right, and what we said before is if he goes to the C gap, then Bond actually needs to fit the inside half of this C gap, and Nakobe Dean can come fit this A gap, and our nickel can play this B gap, all right? But Bond freezes a little bit here, probably because he sees that gap opening wide up. Now, Nakobe Dean knows, because he's a freaking genius when it comes to this stuff, he knows that his gap, when the fullback goes to his right there, is this A gap. And watch how he takes this A gap. No hesitation. I mean, he just knows where to go, and he goes full speed. Bond's still a little new to the game at this point. This is the first week of the season. He's not exactly sure, but he sees that gap open in front of him. Then I think he feels Nakobe Dean come on the outside and go, all right, now I know I can move over to the C gap, right? Which is where his actual fit should be. So he gets to the inside half of the C gap, shows up at just the right time, and they sort of combine to make a really good tackle here. All right, and it's second down. Okay, so now we have a second down in 5, 6, something like that. All right, and Green Bay is in 1 running back here, 1 tight end here. That's 11 personnel again. All right, and now the formation is cluster 3-1 cut. Cluster 3-1 cut from a defensive perspective. Now we're going to get motion. All right, and as the motion comes across, you can see Gardner-Johnson coming down into the box. That means we got another 8-man box. All right, so here's our 8-man box, 8 guys in the box. And that means now we only have 1 back, which equals 1 gap. All right, so now this is a little different. The last one was 2 backs, 2 gaps. This is 1 back, 1 gap. Now that only applies to an 8-man box, but that's what we have here is an 8-man box. All right, so I want you to watch the difference here, how Zach Bond attacks this as compared to the last play where he was a little hesitant. As soon as that ball is snapped, he realizes it's run. He's gone. Right, all he has to do is go attack his gap. Much more successful play for him. All right, I think that might have been a tackle for loss. Actually, let's look at it from the other angle. All right, so as soon as that motion comes across, even before the motion comes across, they have 1 gap because there's only 1 back in the backfield. Okay, so it's hard to see it there because the motion happens pretty quick. But Bond would be right there in that C gap. Nakobe Dean would be right there in that A gap. Gardner Johnson would have that B gap there. All right, now as the motion comes across, now Nakobe Dean has that B gap. Zach Bond has that A gap right there in front of him. And so they can just line up right in that gap. And when the ball is snapped, as long as there's no pullers and it's not a pass, they can just go blitz their gap. All right, and you'll see Bond do that on this. Ball snapped. He's going to get to that gap no matter what. Does a nice job ducking under that block. Right, instead of just staying square and high there, you got punched in the chest. He does a nice job dipping and ripping through his left arm through the guard there. All right, and he did a good job of that all season. Great tackle. All right, much more successful on that play.